if you are in the position of caring for a spouse or a parent, a loved one who is no longer able to care for themselves, or if you know someone who is, this hour will be worth the listening. Now, let's tune in to today's edition of Caregiver Reality with your hosts, David Levy and Paul Vadiato.
Good evening, South Florida, America, and the world. This is the Caregiver Reality Hour, and I'm your host, David Levy, and I'm here with my co-host, Paul. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, David.
All right, we have a couple of guests here in the studio. If you're watching us on caregiverreality.com or on amp2.tv, or for that matter, wwnn1470.com. And you're listening to us on iHeart, or you're hearing us on WWNN 1470 AM here in South Florida. But it's another Tuesday, and we're back, and we have some very interesting guests. One of them is a holdover from last week, and another one is a nice young lady who's far better looking than Paul and I. And so for those of you watching, you can look at her instead of us. Or we, for that matter. Paul, I know it has been a tough week in caregiving. Why don't you give us your 3-minute overview?
I don't know if I had 3 minutes is going to do it, David.
Well,
we really went to a really critical situation on Wednesday with my bride, Deborah. She just sort of bottomed out with her lupus, and it was a direct admit into the hospital. It was very, very scary for her, very scary for myself. We were in Bethesda East Hospital, and I really want to give them a shout out, David. Not only was the care extraordinary, they really did just such a great job. It really was the personal touch. The people who were there, they went out of their way. You know, they have a sign as you go in, we are a 10 hospital. And from the minute that we went through admission, not having us wait, to people picking papers off the floor, to the first night we were there, she was in a room that was very noisy. And as busy as they were, the charge nurse, Sharon, went out of her way to get Debbie a room that was quiet. And I tell you what, it was a great experience.
All right, well then, Bethesda Hospital, thank you for taking good care of my partner and his bride, and that's what we like to hear. But remember, you were also a good advocate.
Well,
I know that.
A little crazy one, but I was good. Well, you kept me towards sanity.
All right. And we had our little week in caregiving. Suzette had been away, but she came back. The plane was late. They lost their luggage, which is not a big caregiving issue, but then Friday she woke up and couldn't pick up her right arm. And so we couldn't find any of our doctors around in the summer. That's tough on a Friday.
Right.
And so we went to the Urgy Center, which I must tell you, the one on Palmetto was very, very good. And
Two for two.
They took us right away, and they seemed to have figured out the problem. But yesterday we went back to her rheumatologist, who made a much more detailed examination and did a lot more of the ooh, ouch, and yipes. And so today she's iced over and not doing a whole heck of a lot, but hopefully she's on the road to recovery. And so it's been an interesting week in caregiving. And you know, for those of you out there, all of you that are caregivers, and our numbers keep climbing, and we seem to be getting more and more men listening. So I think we're kind of a interesting place for people to get information without having to raise your hand and be identified as a caregiver, and that's perfectly fine. You know, going forward, we'll be discussing more of caregiving in the workplace, not tonight, but we'll be bringing some of those issues up in the near future, because more and more we're reading, and I've got a little quote for later, but on Capitol Hill, they've been discussing chronic disease and caregiving in the workplace. And there was a briefing by the Congressional Wellness Caucus a few days ago, where they're talking about the productivity losses in the federal workforce, which also includes the post office. And the interesting thing was there...
Excuse me, David. When you say productivity loss, what do you really mean?
Well, what I mean is when you come to work and you're stressed out, you're worried, you don't feel good, you can't devote 100% to what your boss would like you to do or what the company would like you to do because you're worried. And especially with the degree of caregiving in an aging workforce, more and more we're seeing this kind of, especially spousal caregiving, more and more. And the interesting thing was that there are 2.6 million federal workers. And what they said was that the losses, both medical and productivity-wise, were $27.7 billion. So if you do the math, which I know you won't, but that's $10,000 a federal employee. And they said that the balance between productivity loss due to stress and a variety of things versus direct medical costs was almost 60-40. And so what we're seeing is the reality of something that you and I have spoken about, that I've been aware of for a long time, that caregiving in the workplace is a thing called presenteeism. You're there, but you're really not up to doing the job, as opposed to absenteeism, when you're just not there. That's a little bit easier to identify. And it's growing and growing, and it's going to become more of a legal issue going forward, because if we don't recognize caregiving in the workplace and do more than just flex time or paid leave, because just because you've got a flexible schedule at times doesn't mean that the doctor or the things you have to do for your loved one happen during the flex. And if you're more of a hands-on worker, if you're the guy managing the public supermarket, there's very little that you can do to telecommute. All right? And so if you're not there, the store doesn't run right.
And, you know, it's only going to get worse. The handwriting is on the wall. Population is growing, and it's aging
very quickly. And
those workers are staying in place. So we are going to need to see changes in the workplace, and they're either going to come willingly or they're going to be forced to.
In the last couple of years, retirement age has actually moved from 58 to 62, and they expected that's an average. All right, but we're seeing people that hopefully they feel that they can stay in the workplace till they're 70, because they either have to or they haven't made enough provision as they look forward to seeing what happens in a world of longevity where they didn't plan to be 85 and 90.
Now, David, this legal issue that you spoke about earlier, this is related to the definitions as applies to the Family Medical Leave Act, is that correct?
Well, not so much even the Family Medical Leave Act. Family Medical Leave will then what they're trying to do under Family Medical Leave Act is to make sure that when the caregiver or whoever it is, the individual gets paid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. But this is really something we had discussed a couple of weeks back called FRD, which is Family Relationship Discrimination. And because you're a caregiver, sometimes it's very difficult for you to move around in the workplace, because if you're an active caregiver and they know you're not 100% devoted to what your job description reads, you're not going to raise your hand. And some of the things that we're doing to help caregivers just aren't as effective as being able to contact somebody. It's not always just information and referral. You need somebody that can identify with your issue and help to guide you towards more practical problem solving for it, as opposed to just giving you flex time. Just because you're off doesn't mean you know what to do.
Sure.
All right?
And this is an issue that we'll continue to delve into with more details and look at it a little bit closer in the months to come.
Right. And right now, even though we did it last month, the big Alzheimer's convention is going on in Copenhagen right now. And so hopefully Dr. Brody, who was on a few weeks ago, who's there, will bring us back some of the latest information. And just as a quick aside, this week, those of you, it was pretty hard to miss, it was on the news last night and it's been widely published, that they think one of the early detections for dementia that has plaquing is on the retina of the eye, because the retina is actually part of our central nervous system. And as such, when we see plaquing in the brain, early on, we're starting to see it in the retina. And that, along with the sense of smell, is something that is affected early on with people with dementia. that's the good news. The bad news is if we detect it early, what are we going to do about it? Because right now we don't have anything. However, just as a quick aside, there was a Finnish, from Finland, report that came out that changes in lifestyle and behavior did seem to affect warding off dementia and having better cognitive, or the ability to think and retain and to speak. But that's something we've known about for a while. Healthy body, healthy brain. And it just drives home a point that more and more we're seeing. And the fact that we have rampant obesity, that we're seeing it in younger generations, says we're not off to a good start on the wellness side. And for the last 30 or 40 years, we've made the point over and over again. You got to watch your weight, you got to exercise, you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink, and if you keep yourself in better shape, then the rest of your body will respond. Well, now there may be more of a causative link in fending off dementia. But once again, I'm hoping that out of the Copenhagen Convention that we'll hear whether or not there's some better breakthrough things going on, because certainly in the last few years, everything that we were dealing with went upside down, and the only 3 drugs we have been around for 10 or 11 years.
Sure. For those of you listening out there, if you go to our Facebook page, Caregiver Reality, you'll see the article posted there and some of the comments that have been made. And one of the questions that I had posed was, given this new information, is this something that you would really want to know? If once you get your affairs in order, would you want to know that this is a strong possibility in your life? And it's a wide range of opinion on that.
Well, I know that over the last couple of years, as I deal with family caregivers in my support groups and one-on-one, some of the issues that come up when you've got a mother who's had dementia, or for that matter even a father, but it's more statistically significant when it comes down the maternal genetic path. And daughters will come forward and say, should I be tested? And I always ask, when you spoke to your daughter, they discussed it with you, or for a son for that matter. I said, do they want to know? And what I hear more and more is, no, they don't. Because if there isn't something to do about it, why would you really want to know if there was nothing that they could do or that you could do other than a lifestyle change, which might help, but it's iffy.
Yeah, that sort of Damocles always hanging overhead.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, because our 2 guests, once we get started, we're going to take a break at around 5:20. It's only 5:15 now. And, one of our sponsors has been the Medical Research Charities, which is doing a wonderful job. They also are dealing with the federal employees by giving them an opportunity to donate to the charities of their choice. And each week we try and give a shout out to one of the underlying organizations. And what I thought I would do, because Medical Research Charities has their commercial that will be on shortly, but I don't want to take up the time afterwards so that our guests can get right into their conversation. And so this week we're giving a shout out to the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and that's one that I wholeheartedly support. And to be very candid, I had prostate cancer 11 years ago, and they had to remove my prostate, true confessions, but here it is 11 years later, and if you catch it early and you do the right stuff, it's very much a survivable event. It's not something that you should hide behind. It's not something that you shouldn't discuss with your doctor, because there are things that can be done. The surgery is getting better and better. The machines that they're using, detection methods.
Right.
And so it's something that all men need to be aware of, and not to be afraid to speak to your general practitioner or your urologist or whomsoever, because early intervention can save you not only suffering with cancer, but all the after the fact, and it's a little too late remediation like radiation and chemotherapy, which is no fun. So anyway, the Prostate Cancer Foundation is the world's leading philanthropic organization funding and accelerating research It was founded in 1993, and it has raised nearly $500 million and provided funding to more than 1,600 research projects at 200 institutions in 15 countries. The Prostate Cancer Foundation advocates for greater awareness of prostate cancer and more efficient investment of government research funds supporting transformational cancer research. Our efforts have helped produce a 20-fold increase in government funding. Having said that, I think that we all need to recognize, as we say every week, that the federal government, the National Institute of Health, has cut back on the amount of funding that they can do because of all the budgetary constraints. So where they have been able, the Prostate Cancer Foundation, to accelerate federal government involvement, that's not to say that it hasn't still been cut back along with everybody else. And as a last point, we've been talking because one of their underlying organizations is Scripps, which you heard the whole big brouhaha about them merging with the University of Southern California.
Right.
But that's now been called off, and they're exploring different ways of raising money to move forward. And I think for those of you that know about Scripps, both in La Jolla and here in Jupiter, Florida, I think that gave the researchers a much greater feeling that the organization was behind them. And so going forward, I hope they find what they need, because they're a great research organization. We're going to be having some folks on from there in the next month or so. They got a little sidetracked with all of the issues going on.
And Medical Research Charities is that organization that has, is it 27 now, David?
Yep.
27 national organizations of fighting various diseases. And if you wish to contribute, you can contribute through MRC, Medical Research Charities.org, and you can designate where you would like the money to go. And I would suggest, help out here, because this research is so important.
Right. And if you go to that website, medicalresearchcharities.org, all of the underlying charities are listed,
and linked.
You can actually, the links are all there, and so you can go pick the one you want, see what they're doing. You can make a direct contribution that way, or through MRC for all of them, or MRC with a specific direction to which organization you'd like to support. Anyway, it's 5:20. Let's take our station break, and we'll be back and start with our guests.
CFC support helps fund research. You can too. Each year, thousands of men and women serving their country in the U.S. military, as well as other employees of the federal government and the U.S. Postal Service, provide support for medical research to find treatments and cures for diseases. This is done through the Combined Federal Campaign, an annual workplace giving campaign that allows eligible individuals to support charities, such as those that conduct medical research, through a payroll deduction. Money donated this way to the medical research charities and its member organizations helps fund research to fight diseases from Alzheimer's to cancer, multiple sclerosis, blindness, breathing disorders, and much more. The diseases included afflict people of all ages, from the very young to the very old. You don't need to be a member of the military or a federal government employee to support research to help you or those you love that are suffering from an illness or disease. Donations to our not-for-profit tax-exempt organizations are tax-deductible and provide a vital source of funding in the fight to defeat some of life's most dreaded diseases. Please visit the website of the Medical Research Charities, which can be found at medicalresearchcharities.org. That's all one word, medicalresearchcharities.org. On that website, you can learn more about our member charities and make a donation in support of the research they're conducting for a specific disease or family of diseases. You can make a donation to Medical Research Charities itself and support the work of all our member charities. Please visit our website today, medicalresearchcharities.org. Become a part of joining forces to find a cure. Are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse or loved one who can no longer take care of himself or herself? Are you dealing with Alzheimer's disease and don't know what to do? Do you feel burned out, frustrated, and just don't know where to turn? You've tried doctors, lawyers, and mental health professionals and have come to realize that they don't have practical answers to these questions. What you need are experts, non-clinical family caregivers with 25 years of active experience helping thousands of family caregivers like yourself. People who can help you provide a better quality of life for yourself and your loved one. Who you need are David Levy or Paul Vadiato. Reach David at david@caregiverreality.com or reach Paul at caregiverreality.com and let them help you pick the right path towards improving the quality of life for you, the caregiver, and your loved one.
I am Paul Vadiato, president of CareGiver Reality and a full-time spousal caregiver. When I arrive at the office to begin my workday, my caregiving role doesn't get left outside the door. My day is often interrupted dealing with issues at home. That is time not focused on my job. I am but one of the 50 million unpaid family caregivers. Caregiving in the workplace is a costly productivity issue that is only going to increase as our workforce gets older. Caregiver-friendly firms retain hard-to-replace team members, tend to attract better talent, and get out in front of the productivity loss that exists everywhere. Now, new questions are being raised as to possible exposure to discrimination lawsuits as employees question whether their role as a caregiver is damaging them as promotions are denied or reprimands increase that might result in a termination. Caregiving in the workplace, left unaddressed, is costing your firm money, reputation, and possible litigation. CareGiver Reality brings education and training solutions to the workplace. Let our experienced team help evaluate your unique situation. Contact me at paul@caregiverreality.com. That's paul@caregiverreality.com. Do it today.
This is Caregiver Reality with gerontologist David Levy and caregiver expert Paul Vadiato, who ask you to call in and speak with him on the air toll-free at 888-565-1470. That's 888-565-1470 to share a story or important information. Now, back to today's Caregiver Reality Show.
And we're back, and you're listening to the Caregiver Reality Hour. As all of those commercials kind of related, you can see us on caregiverreality.com, on AMP number 2.tv, and on WWNN 1470am.com. I was wrong before. You can hear us on iHeartRadio, and you're listening to us on 1470 AM here in the South Florida area. Paul, I never realized when you came to work with me that you're a caregiver. You're fired. That's what happens with caregiving in the workplace.
You'll be hearing
folks.
from my lawyer in the morning.
All right. No, but this is an issue that we'll be discussing at much greater length. You know, one of the things that we talk about, and that's very, very important to us, is the care and the treatment of caregivers, unpaid family caregivers. We no longer call them informal because there's nothing informal about what they do. And many times, and Paul has spoken about it, and I'll just repeat it before we get started, is that caregiving is agnostic, which means caregiving doesn't care how old you are, who you are, what the relationship is, what the disease is. Caregivers and caregiving happen across the spectrum. It doesn't matter what, who, where, or why. And as a result of that, any disease, irrespective of what it is, and there are times we get a little focused on Alzheimer's only because it's as difficult as it is, but I don't care what the disease is, there's somewhere in there that there's a caregiver, and that's a caregiver we're focusing on, because when we do non-clinical family caregiving, we don't need to know about the disease because all of the clinicians are dealing with the disease of your loved one. You need to know about practical problem solving. And last week we had on Michael, who's back with us tonight, and Paul's going to introduce him. But as we have said before, addiction is a disease, and addiction has caregivers. and many times they're miscast as being part of the problem as opposed to being a piece of the solution. And we have with us tonight another guest, which I'm going to leave to Paul as well, a young lady who has a very interesting story to tell. So, Paul, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to welcome you back. This is Michael Herbert. Michael's a good friend and has been working in the field of addictions for over 25 years. He's worked in all phases of treatment, from intervention to aftercare. He's an addiction counselor, recovery coach, and group facilitator, and he's done his work both here in the United States and internationally, and he's just simply one of the best. And Michael, I want to thank you for coming back. I have to say, your appearance last week just resonated everywhere. I had so many comments about what you had to say, and really they wanted to know a lot more. So thank you for coming back today. And you have a guest. I'm going to let you introduce your guest, and then we'll sort of get into it.
I want to thank you, both David and Paul, for having me again this week. It was a pleasure being there last week and a pleasure this week. But I'd like to introduce a friend of mine, Keisha Scott, who is a mental health counselor here locally in the Delray, Palm Beach area. And she is also a mother and a full-time employee and company owner, along with being in recovery herself.
Thanks for having me today.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Yeah.
All right, Michael. Paul, I know, has a bunch of questions, and I must tell you the responses, as Paul said, to you being on last week really resonated. We had quite a dialogue going on across many different media.
Oh, that's great.
And when it got up on YouTube, you were definitely a hero.
Okay.
Not only because you run in ultra marathons, which just amazes me. The story you told last week, and I won't interrupt, but when you started to run across the Sahara for 150 miles. And
155.
155, and
Yeah.
at 18, I think you said, your sneakers gave out and you had to run in Tevas the rest
For
of the way.
137 miles. But it's funny about addiction. You're doing a race like that,
Right.
and addiction is everywhere. Literally, I think on the fourth day, we were going up a dune, and my feet were really hurting.
I'm surprised they were still with you.
I mean, they were hurting. And, somebody offered me Percocet
Oh.
out on the race. 120 degrees in the Sahara Desert.
Oh my God.
And I'm going to take Percocet? No, thank you.
All right.
But drugs are just everywhere.
Right. Was there a street corner?
Yeah, we were in the middle of the
Over
desert.
here?
There's a backpack.
Michael, what is the size and scope of the problem when we talk about addictions? And
So in the United States, there are literally 60 million people who have the disease of addiction, whether it's alcohol or other drugs. And that doesn't include nicotine and sugar,
Okay.
which are both drugs and both affect people.
So are you also talking about things like eating, sexual addiction, gambling? Do those fit into that
Internet,
60?
No, that's not included in
Oh,
that.
so you're just talking alcohol
I'm
and
talking
drugs.
about alcohol and
Substance.
drugs. Yeah, substances.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, most Americans are affected in some way, not to say that they're all addicted, but they have brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, neighbors, co-workers, and are affected by addiction. This is a chronic, progressive, and fatal illness that's categorized by a loss of control.
All right. And,
Yeah.
and that was one of the questions I just wanted to touch base with you on. I know that there are times that people who drink can be obnoxious to the people around them, but not necessarily to the point where they can't stop drinking. And I've often heard it said that when your alcohol is a problem for you and others, that's kind of a definition of being, a substance abuser. How do you feel about that affecting others portion?
Well, if your substance abuse is affecting yourself and others, it's a problem. And if that's the case, then the best thing to do is seek out help. So you have to determine, or a professional can determine, is this substance abuse or substance dependence?
And the distinction is?
Well, I believe with substance abuse, it could be curbed and, slowed down. But substance dependence, you can't tell someone, well, why don't you just have they don't know when to say when.
Or they can't.
It's impossible. Just say no does not work for a person who's chemically dependent.
And you can abuse drugs and then not become dependent, I think is the distinction.
Michael, how did you first get to know Keisha?
Well, I got to know Keisha through her husband, who I used to run on the streets with.
Yes.
And
that also could be misinterpreted.
And not on those streets, but the streets of Boca and Delray, we would run 5 miles in the morning.
Right.
And I would stop by the house around 5:30 in the morning and pick him up, and we'd go running. So that's how I met Keisha. And then later on, Keisha's father helped me with the ultra marathon, giving me a training regime. So I know her from her husband and her father. Yeah.
Okay. And you chose her to be here to tell her story this evening because?
Well, because I think Keisha is really one of the rare individuals who got into recovery not from treatment, but got into recovery just
by saying no.
Well, I don't know about saying no, but reaching out for help through the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. That she went that route directly versus to a treatment program. So she sought out a 12-step solution.
Okay.
Keisha, can you tell us a little bit of your background and a little bit of your story going back to the early days?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think what's kind of noteworthy about my story is that I did have a good childhood. I grew up in a wonderful family. My father's a successful professor, and I have 3 brothers. And because I think often the perception is that drug addicts or alcoholics come from bad families. So interestingly enough, I grew up in a wonderful family. But what was and we were taught a lot of great values and ideas, but some of them were some of them were like, the world owes you nothing. If you really want something, you can achieve whatever you want. So all good things, except for when you are an alcoholic or drug addict, because when I came face to face with addiction, none of that worked. I wasn't able to just decide that I wanted to be different. I wasn't able to work hard to be different. And all those things worked well in my career and in sports. And so when I came face to face with addiction, all that stuff failed me. And that, is really when I sought outside help. But, to go back a little bit, I grew up in a very athletic home. Performing was really important in our house. And, all was well, I think, until we moved here. My dad got a job here, and we moved to Boca Raton, Florida. And there's just so much focus here on being a certain way. And as a young girl, I had a lot of insecurities, and I felt super inadequate. And I was introduced to drugs and alcohol relatively young. And quickly, I just think I found it to be a great escape from all the regular insecurities. And I think that's what happens, and it's happening more and younger now, I think. But so, high school and college pretty much went on the same, and the basic theme of my life was an underachiever, really. When you're using drugs and alcohol often, I don't think you really achieve too much. And because I came from a very high achieving home, the bar was set high, and I was always coming in a little bit low, which left a lot of room for insecurities and a really low self-esteem. So that kind of perpetuated the drug use and the alcoholism. All that, I graduated college somehow. I squeaked through that. I mean, nothing amazing that I did there, but I graduated.
That's good.
Yeah, I did get the degree. My dad told me it was a meal ticket and one that I should get, so I did that. But when I was 27 years old, I was working in the corporate world as a pharmaceutical rep. I was making $100,000 a year, and my electricity was often turned off because I could not function as an adult because I was drinking and using drugs. So, to make a really long long story very short, I just came up against that time and time again, and there's tons of stories, but the bottom line is I was left feeling, very, very, really bad about myself, and the anxiety increased. I originally sought therapy for anxiety, thinking that was my problem, not really associating that with drinking. And, I got really lucky. I got a therapist, and having got my master's at this point, we learn in therapy not to really give our opinion, and I got really lucky to get a very opinionated therapist who told me I was an alcoholic. And I didn't really like that. My uncle died at 43 of alcoholism, and so that what I knew, what I thought an alcoholic was first of all, I thought it was probably a man, and I really thought it was somebody who probably didn't have a very good job, and certainly I felt like I was living the high life. I didn't really think that it was possible that I was an alcoholic. So she recommended I try to do some controlled drinking and just drink a little bit and come back. Now looking back on it, I think she probably knew I couldn't do that. And in the end, I came, face to face with myself, and I realized that I was living a double life. By day I was this pharmaceutical rep with a suit and my hair pulled back, and by night I was this wild, insecure woman doing all sorts of things that she said she'd never do. And I really just decided to hang it up early. And to this day, I'm so grateful for that decision. But I admitted I was an alcoholic, and she sent me to AA, and I haven't really looked back since. I'm 12 years sober, and I've seen a lot in my 12 years. I've seen a lot of people not make it. Most of the people that I got sober with aren't either here today or they're drinking today. And like I think most caregivers, my parents really didn't know what to do with the disease of alcoholism, and I think that in large part relates to your topic. It's uncomfortable and foreign, and the difference between alcoholism and a lot of diseases you guys talk about is that it's also shameful. Not just for the caregiver, but for the addict or alcoholic themselves. Being in the corporate world, I was this newly sober woman, pretty much really performing better than I'd ever performed before. I was available. I actually went to work. I wasn't drunk. I was doing really great things, and yet I was supposed to keep this a secret. So that's, I think, where alcoholism and drug addiction really is different than the majority of diseases. We look at other diseases and we have compassion and concern. We talk about it, but addiction really is kept a little bit secret. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things that also is important to note is about the shame of addiction. Mm-hmm. And family members feel ashamed that they have someone in their family that's using drugs. And then they have another level of shame that they won't stop using drugs for me, that they don't love me enough to stop using drugs.
Or I didn't do a good enough job as a parent. I guess it depends on if you're the wife or the parent. But I do think that people take it, as...
I have a question to ask. You related in the very beginning that you came from a great family. But by your own words, they set the bar high, from an achievement perspective. And while that might be great, as you look back in hindsight, was that high bar some of the reasons that you began to have your own insecurities? I mean, I recognize moving to Boca was a change from what you had grown up in, and when you said all of a sudden I showed up and I had insecurities, it was just an interesting juxtaposition between how you've been raised and your perception of yourself following the move. And I just wonder if you just might elaborate on that.
Well, it's interesting. It's hard to tell the whole story in a short amount of time. But I grew up on an Indian reservation. That's where I was born, and then we moved around a lot. My parents were really hippies, and in large part, I think a lot of the high expectations I put on myself. I learned. I think I figured out really early that I wasn't going to put in a lot of work. Even as a young kid. I mean, once we did a child triathlon, and I actually cheated. I actually ran through the building. So like I figured out pretty early, I think, that I wasn't going to do all the work associated with the outcome that was desired. So I think I put a lot of those expectations on myself, and I decided really early that if I was really good at maybe misbehaving or being really funny or something, that I could get attention from that. And I think I just consciously sort of went down that road. I think the expectations were not only created by myself, but really from what I saw from the outside. People looked like they were successful. And a lot of stuff people don't talk about. So as a kid, you just decide that these people are successful and happy.
And that's not me.
Right.
But I do have to, for the benefit of the Chamber of Commerce, say, just because you moved to Boca Raton will not automatically make you an underachiever or an addict.
Correct.
Keisha, if I may, you said you made a decision that you were going to seek recovery and that you wanted to change things. Tell us about that moment and how you went about it and what those early days were like for you.
I'd love to tell you that the last night I drank was really something interesting or mind-blowing, but it really was just another night filled with me kind of just pushing the bar. My girlfriend wanted to go home, and of course I didn't want to go home, and once again I stayed and stayed and stayed, and that was the first night. This is my childhood friend. It was the first night she ever looked at me and said, "I'm done, I'm leaving, and please don't call me tomorrow crying, because I'm done with the way you live your life." And she left, and that was the first time, and to this day I thank her for that. And in the morning I had to work with my boss, who was a very buttoned up woman, and I can just remember waking up that morning. I couldn't find my keys, I couldn't find my car. It was just like a disaster, really. And I just remember thinking that, like, finally, my two worlds had met. This woman was coming to work with me, and I wasn't prepared, and I was a disaster, and who knows what I had done the night before. And really the truth is I just had enough of myself. I'd really gotten to the point where I'd had enough, and it even says in the big book, that if you're lucky enough to catch it early, to get to that point, that's a possibility. I think that the world there's so much more treatment now, and there's so much more of that stuff that people and kids start so much younger that people really take it somewhere else. But I do think that it's quite possible to recognize that you have a problem and seek help and not go as far as many people do.
Well, I think one of the important things that you said, and this is what I believe, when the people around the addict or alcoholic change, it forces the addict or alcoholic to change. So when your friend said she was done, it sounds like that had a real impact on you, and it brought you to some reality. And thank God you have a friend like that, because a lot of times people will look at the behavior and just don't want to say anything. I don't want to upset Keisha. But they'll talk about you behind your back, but they're really not ready to take a stand.
Yep.
And when family and friends are willing and ready to take a stand, change does happen. So that's on some level why I believe that on some level families need to almost be in treatment before the addict or the alcoholic, because they will really affect change, because they really don't know what to do on the other end, and they tend to get less information. The addict goes away for treatment. They get all of this help, and the family gets a week or a couple of hours of family therapy, and then are left to kind of figure it out on their own.
Well, that's caregivers too.
You come
down
I'm
with
looking
a
at
disease.
family members as caregivers,
Right.
and they're really not given the education and support that really is necessary to address what's going on in their household with that addict, and also what's going on with them.
Right.
Because they are just as, on some level, sick as a person who is using. And if you look at trips and falls and depression and that, family members are going through the exact same thing as addicts and alcoholics are going through. But the addict and the alcoholic gets the attention because they're identified as the one with the problem. Family members may be looked at as the heroes, but they're dying, and they're helping. And a lot of that stuff needs to change and needs to be looked at. So everybody in this process needs help.
And the dynamic of the relationships change so much. Early recovery is so difficult, and the people, specifically, if I speak for myself, I mean, my family, I'm very lucky. Everybody got right on board. My brother read the big book like the first week that I was sober. My parents researched it, and everybody got on board. And thank goodness, because I was going through a lot, and I needed them to understand. My mom came to some meetings with me, and she was shocked, because there is such a stigma
attached
So,
to it.
yeah.
And that was one of my questions that I had, was how did your siblings react when you finally admitted to something that they must have realized for a while? Why do you think they didn't intervene sooner, if they could have? I mean, I heard what Michael just said about, you don't know what to do, or you may be afraid to do it because you're going to alienate your sister or whatever the circumstance may
Right.
be.
Well, one of the negative things about my family is that we also, learn to put forward, our best, and to really present as if things were okay a little bit. And so I think I did a really good job of that for the most part. I mean, I did a good job and all those things, like I said. So my older brother is the only one who really knew the gravity of what was going on. And I think, he really didn't have much of education about addiction, so he listened to me and did his best. But I don't think he was surprised that I got sober. But to your question, I don't think he had any idea how or when he would have needed to intervene. And
All right, well, that's a very fair answer. And for the people that are out there that have brothers and sisters or family, that are addicted and wonder why the family didn't do a better job of helping them, if they could even recognize it from that perspective. I think
Right.
that's a very, very interesting answer.
and we're hard folks to help sometimes. We're pretty
Keisha,
stubborn.
We're coming
Paul,
up.
move the microphone.
I'm sorry, Keisha. We're coming up towards the end of our hour.
Amazing how fast.
It really is amazing how fast. What are your final thoughts that you would like our listeners to have? And also, after you give those thoughts, if someone wants to reach out and to get in touch with you, how would they do that, please?
Okay. I guess my final thought would just to be, if somebody out there is struggling with addiction, that, it isn't a gloom and doom thing. I've been sober 12 years, and it's the greatest gift of my life. I think I'm a better mother for it. I've gone on to get my master's and do all sorts of things that, I probably never would have done without recovery. So it's an amazing way of life. And our website is www.grncare.com. So if anybody has more questions or kind of just wants to check us out.
www.g, like in George, Roger, N, like in New York.
Yep. Care.com. You got it.
Okay.
And Michael?
And I just want to underline what Keisha said. There's a lot of help and a lot of hope out there, and it's not all gone. But, we talk about people dying from addiction. There's probably more people suffering in addiction, and there's a lot of help out there. So, we got to do what we can to get those people off the streets and get them the help that they need off the streets, out of corporations, out of everywhere. So they're not just on the streets, they're everywhere we look.
Speak to their families, Michael, who are struggling at home, seeing what's going on. What do you say to them?
I mean, really seek out some help. There are plenty of phone numbers that you can call, people you can help to assist you in addressing the problem, because sometimes it's just too much for one person, a wife, a husband, a child, or a parent to handle on their own. You can try it on your own, but if it's not working and you're starting to repeat yourself, seek out some help and get some support and develop a plan.
Keisha, I have one other question to ask you. You talked about the night that your friend said, "I'm through. I can't do this with you anymore." And we often talk about people have to bottom out. Was that a bottom, or was that just the realization that you had to make a change?
Probably.
Could you have kept on doing it,
Yes,
notwithstanding the
yeah.
fact that your friend wasn't going to be a part of it any longer?
Yes, I could have kept on doing it. I think it was a realization that my world was getting smaller, and then the people left standing were people who really didn't care about me. all of that stuff's so fleeting and not intimate, and there was no connection left because the people that are left in your life are not people who are going to really support you. So when those people start disappearing, when my brother told me, look, call me when you're ready to get help, and my best friend told me I'm done, you start to really take a look at your life.
And every bottom has a trap door, so it can always get worse. What's nice that Keisha did is she responded at that point. And she's lucky that she did, because it certainly could have gotten worse.
Keisha's story, though, is more the exception than the rule, is it not, Michael?
I would say there are probably more people out there continuing to use than are in recovery. And that's the sad thing about it. If we spent less money on housing people in prison and more money on treatment, you might have better outcomes.
Well, this is the same argument that you hear about mental health.
Yeah.
All right. And Keisha, I just want to say, you are not only articulate, but you spoke very candidly. You answered the questions very forthright. You've been a wonderful guest. And I just want to say, from my perspective, that you should be very, very proud of yourself, and that whatever your parents set out there as an achiever, you can definitely say you achieved.
Thank you so much.
And it's a great story to hear.
You raised the bar.
Thank you.
Michael, last thoughts, and how do people contact you?
I can be reached at www.recoveryguide.net. If you want to email me, I'm at recoveryguide@gmail.com.
recoveryguide@gmail.com.
Yep.
All right. And you'll be able to see Michael and Keisha tomorrow some point. It'll be on caregiverreality.com. It'll be out there on YouTube. It'll be everywhere. And so tell your friends if they really want to hear a success story in recovery and hear from an expert like Michael. This is not a show to miss, and you can see it at your convenience, and you really should. And Paul, before we go, I want to thank you, because it was your relationship with Michael that first brought him here last week, and bringing Keisha in this week.
Awesome.
I think we have really done our audience a favor.
Well, I'm not going to let this guy go quite yet.
All right.
But, to our audience that is listening out there who have these struggles, we are here for you. 4 of us sitting here tonight talking about this topic. Reach out to any one of us if you have questions, or if you have issues that you want to talk about and you have no one else that you feel you can go to. We are available for you either through our website, David at caregiverreality.com, Paul at caregiverreality.com, and both Keisha and Michael gave you their contact information as well. I think this was just an amazing show, and I want to thank you both for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to be with us tonight, and it was just amazing.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
These were stories worth telling. And I'm very, very pleased, and I understand you're a new mom.
I have 7-year-old twins and a 7-month-old baby. So
okay, well then you
I'm a
have
new and
lots of
old
things
mom.
to do rather than drink.
Yes, I do.
And that's just terrific.
And you have you're a caregiver, are you not? Also, you had mentioned before.
Yes. Well, in many senses. So now I'm a counselor, so I counsel young girls in recovery, and I caregive obviously all day long at home. And
right. When you say young girls, give me an age bracket, because you say
that
you're
is-
seeing it younger and younger.
I take on 5 case management clients at a time. So I help them post-recovery, post-treatment. They have to navigate life then, and some of that's pretty difficult. So I help them sort of go through the first 6 months. And I would say my clients range from probably 19 to 25, 26. I do have somebody who's 40 right now, but that isn't super common. For what I do, but it's pretty young.
Good.
And Michael, the people that you typically see, it was funny, I was listening to you have a conversation before, and because I am that age, and you said, well, I know older people that are counselors who are 65 to 70, And I said, "Oi, that's Paul and me."
Yeah.
But what's a typical age range that you deal with?
I work with people from 18 to 80.
Oh, okay.
And so there's no typical age range. There's no typical client that I work with.
Okay.
So I can reasonably assess who I can work well with, and if it's going to be a struggle for me, I refer it to someone else. Yes.
Okay. We only have a couple of minutes left, and Paul, I know that earlier tonight you had lots of good things to say about Bethesda Hospital, and I'll just repeat it, that they did a wonderful job with Debbie, and I'm very, very pleased to hear that. And one other thing, I want to give a shout out to two people. One is Eleanor, who's a regular listener who happens to be in the hospital tonight, and another one to Bernice, who's out in Minnesota with her daughter. Best of luck with that situation. We're all thinking about you, and we're all praying that things will work out okay.
And a shout out also to Arden Courts, one of our sponsors, along with Scott Sokoff at Sokoff Legal. Thank you for supporting us and the program.
All right, and folks, next week we'll be back Tuesday from 5 to 6 drive time. We will try and have, we have a couple more guests lined up very soon that I think you will find equally as interesting, maybe not as attractive, but all right, that's the sexist in me, I apologize. But it's been a great show tonight. I want to thank the two of you, Paul as always, and to South Florida, America, and the world. It's been a pleasure bringing you the Caregiver Reality Hour. Paul?
Good night, everyone, and caregivers, take good care of yourself.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Reality Show. Each week, David Levy, a gerontologist, and Paul Vadiato, a caregiver expert with a combined over 25 years of experience, providing practical and realistic help to caregivers struggling to keep up with the needs of a loved one who are unable to care for himself or herself. To reach David Levy, email him at david@caregiverreality.com. Or to reach Paul Vadiato, email paul@caregiverreality.com. And find out more online. Just go to caregiverreality.com. See you next week for another exciting show of Caregiver Reality. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management,